Welcome. I'm going to put this into PowerPoint form so that I can start going through the slides. This is Chapter 8, Photosynthesis. And so in this chapter, we're going to talk about photosynthetic organisms, what photosynthesis is. We focus on plant photosynthesis, so there are a lot of other organisms that can also photosynthesize. Typically, the difference is where in the organism photosynthesis will occur and what types of pigments they use. All right. So photosynthesis is the ability to take in solar energy and convert it into food energy, like carbohydrates. Organisms that do this are called autotrophic organisms, and organisms that can't do this are called heterotrophs, and they typically feed on those autotrophs. So autotrophs are producers and heterotrophs are consumers. We are heterotrophs. Photosynthesis occurs in mainly the leaves of plants, but in the green parts of plants, but particularly the leaves. Water is going to come in through the roots. Carbon dioxide enters through a region called the stomata, which you'll see on the next page. And energy from the sun is absorbed by chlorophyll in plants, sometimes other pigment molecules in other organisms. And this chlorophyll is found in an organelle called the chloroplast, where photosynthesis occurs. And so here you can see the stomata, where carbon dioxide can come in, oxygen can leave. So it's just a little tiny hole, and we have multiple stomata within a plant leaf. This tissue is called mesophyll tissue, which is where photosynthesis typically occurs. Here you have a leaf vein where water is going to be running through. And if we go a little closer, you'll see within the mesophyll tissue, we have these organelles called chloroplast. In the chloroplast, we have two major regions. We have thylakoid, and we have stacks of thylakoid. We call them grana of thylakoid. And this is where one set of the reactions occurs. This is where the chlorophyll is found. And then outside of the thylakoid is called the stomata, or I'm sorry, not stomata, the stroma. And the stroma is where the Calvin cycle or light independent reactions occur. So what's actually happening in photosynthesis? Carbon dioxide is taken in, as is water, and we take and reduce the carbon dioxide, so add hydrogen ions and electrons to the carbon dioxide, and we oxidize the water, so we take away those hydrogen ions and electrons, and we produce glucose, which is a carbohydrate, and we produce oxygen. And so this actually is the opposite reaction to the cell respiration, which you saw in the last chapter. In photosynthesis, we have two major sets of reactions. One is called the light reaction, where we're actually taking in light, sunlight energy. So this is the photo portion of photosynthesis. And then the second set of reactions is light independent. And this is where we actually synthesize the carbohydrate. So this is the synthesis portion, also termed the Calvin cycle. And again, just so you recall where everything occurs, water is taken in, and water will enter that the thylakoid within the chloroplast. Carbon dioxide is taken in. Carbon dioxide enters the stroma of the chloroplast. Solar energy is taken in and enters the thylakoid of the chloroplast, and the water is going to be split, oxygen is going to be released, and after the Calvin cycle, after all of the reactions occur, we will have a carbohydrate that will be released for use by the cell. So there are a lot of different wavelengths of solar energy. The energy that I'm talking about is the visible light. So here we have this visible light of solar energy, and this is the energy that the plants are going to take in. A very small amount of energy here, or a small amount of the entire spectrum of light rays, but this is where our plants take in light. And they typically take in and absorb the different wavelengths, and they reflect the green wavelength, and that is why plants look green. Interesting tidbit of information. So violet has the highest energy, but it is the shortest wavelength. Red has the longest wavelength and the shortest amount of energy, or lowest amount of energy. Only about 42% of solar radiation hits the Earth. Most of it is going to be found within that visible light range. And so here you can see the different types of chlorophylls and other non-chlorophyll absorbing pigment molecules. And you can see that they absorb these violet and blue, but they typically don't absorb in that green and yellow area, and then they start absorbing again out here in that red area. And what that means, and carotenoids typically only absorb in the violet and blue and green, and then they stop absorbing. So what that means is what they absorb, they're using, and they reflect the other colors. So when chlorophyll molecules stop being able to reflect, when they start breaking down in the autumn, these carotenoids are the ones that are going to now be reflecting, and that's why the leaves change color. So it's kind of interesting there, right? And this is what I just explained on the last slide. So you can read through that and then we'll move on, okay? So I told you there were two sets of reactions, the light reactions or light-dependent reactions, and then light-independent reactions. So we're going to look at the light-dependent reactions first, and then we'll, which contain two different types of reactions, and then we'll go into the light-independent reactions. So within the light reactions, this type of reaction takes place during the day when there is sunlight. We have two sets or two pathways, the non-cyclic pathway and the cyclic pathway. Both produce energy in the form of ATP, and both are going to use solar energy, but only one of those pathways produces reducing power called NADPH. So the non-cyclic pathway produces both ATP and NADPH. So it uses a coenzyme carrier, just like in cellular respiration, you had that coenzyme carrier NAD. Now we have a coenzyme carrier called NADP. So this coenzyme is going to act like a taxi and pick up the hydrogen ions and electrons that are released from the water being broken down or oxidized when you release the oxygen, and carry those hydrogen ions and electrons to the Calvin cycle. The non-cyclic pathway uses two photosystems, photosystem 2 and photosystem 1, and they use them in that order. Photosystem 2 is the first photosystem used. Photosystem 1 is the second photosystem used. So a lot of times people are like, why are they named that way? That's just weird, which it is. You're correct. They were named for how they were found. Photosystem 2 was found second. Photosystem 1 was found first. So we learned about the cyclic pathway before the non-cyclic pathway. The cyclic pathway only uses photosystem 1. Once they found the other photosystem and they learned that pathway, they were like, well, we have PS2 that is going to send electrons to PS1. So it's just kind of an interesting way that they name things, and instead of renaming, they just leave it, and it just kind of seems a little bit weird. So the photosystems are what pull in sunlight energy, and they then can take in electrons and activate those electrons, causing them to become more and more charged. And when they do that, the electrons move up in energy levels until they jump out of that reaction center and to an electron carrier or electron acceptor that will then shuffle it along a pathway. The electrons come from the splitting of water. So when water is taken in by those the roots, and the water moves up through those veins, the water moves into the mesophyll tissue and is split. So we release the oxygen, which is released through those stomata. So plants, when they exhale, they get rid of oxygen and they take in carbon dioxide. And so we gain benefits from those plants. The carbon dioxide stays in the system, and the hydrogen ions from the water stay in the system as well, and move into that reaction center of photosystem 2. Sorry, this is a lot of writing. I do have a really nice picture that I'll show you shortly. So when the electrons get energized, they move from photosystem 2 into an electron transport chain. So remember in last chapter you learned about the electron transport chain in cellular respiration? Well, it's roughly the same thing. We have these electron carriers, or not electron carriers, we have these enzymes that shuffle electrons. So they move electrons from one protein to another protein down a concentration gradient until they can move into photosystem 1. And as they do that, hydrogen ions that were released from the splitting of water can move across a membrane, producing an ion gradient just like in cell respiration. And those hydrogen ions can only move back from higher to lower concentration through an ATP synthase protein. And as those hydrogens flow through the ATP synthase protein, they cause the protein complex to spin, activating it, producing ATP. And then those electrons enter the reaction center of photosystem 1. So when reaction center photosystem 1 takes in or absorbs the sunlight energy, it again activates that electron. The electron moves up in energy levels and eventually will jump, but when it jumps this time, it's going to jump and attach to NADP. NADP will also grab the hydrogen ion that flowed from higher to lower concentration down that concentration gradient through the ATP synthase molecule. NADP attaches to that and grabs that electron, becoming NADPH, which will then move into the Calvin cycle. And so this is that picture I told you about. So here we have photosystem 2, and here we have photosystem 1. Water is going to be split. These hydrogen ions are going to stay here. The water, or the oxygen, is going to be released. So for every 2 water molecules, we get 1 oxygen molecule that is released. The electrons move into photosystem 2, right here, the reaction center of photosystem 2, I should say. The hydrogen ions are going to move across this plasma membrane that is right here, this little membrane here. The electrons, when sunlight energy comes in, it activates the reaction center, and the electrons move up in energy levels, eventually jumping to this electron transport chain and being shuffled from one electron protein carrier to another. The hydrogen ions are going to be passed across this membrane. We're going to have a high energy gradient of hydrogen ions on one side, and they're going to be able to flow through the ATP synthase molecule to get back. So when they do that, they're going to then attach to this NADP molecule. The electrons, as they lose energy, eventually will move into the reaction center of photosystem 1. So here we have those same electrons. This reaction center also takes in sunlight energy. The pigment molecules absorb the energy and activate the electron. The electron moves up in energy levels and eventually jumps, attaching to the NADP, and we produce NADPH, which will move to the Calvin cycle. I'm going to stop here so that we can, I'm going to actually play a video for you on the non-cyclic and cyclic pathways, but I have to get that video and make sure it's going to play. And I'll start the next lecture on the cyclic pathway, okay? All right, bye.